He hit me at my sister's wedding because I wouldn't hand over my house. Not a loan, not a discussion, just a demand, and when I said no, my father picked up the cake stand and struck me in front of 160 guests. Hi, I'm Lauren Chen. I'm 33, a biotech professional from Illinois, and for most of my life, I was the quiet daughter, the helper, the extra. But the day my parents tried to take the home I built with my own hands, I stopped being silent. What happened after shocked the entire family and changed the course of my life. Before we dive into the story, let me learn a bit about you. If you're a charming lady, please leave the number 1 in the comments. And if you're a dashing gentleman, leave the number 2. This way, I can send you a special greeting. Now, let's start the story together. I always knew I was the backup plan, the daughter who filled in the gaps when Emily wasn't around to shine. In our family, praise had a spotlight, and I always stood in its shadow. One Tuesday evening, when I was about 8, I came home with a small certificate from school, a participation trophy for a community essay contest. I wasn't expecting fanfare, just a little smile maybe, but at dinner, the moment I pulled the paper from my backpack, Margaret hardly looked up from her plate. Gregory glanced at it and said, "Is this for just showing up?" Meanwhile, Emily had won her school's spelling bee that morning. By dessert, a lemon chiffon cake appeared on the table, with her name iced across the top. They even lit candles, 5 of them, even though it wasn't her birthday. I clapped along with everyone else. That was the game. When you're the quiet one, you become your family's audience, not its headline. At school, I tried to find something I could own. In the spring play, I was cast as a tree. Not the tree, just a tree. I wore a cardboard trunk strapped to my chest and waved green construction paper leaves, while Emily, in her piano recital gown, took photos with our parents on the other side of town. I watched their car pull away before the curtain even rose. The girl who played the squirrel got a bigger round of applause than I did. I didn't cry. I remember feeling numb. Sometimes, numb is easier than hope. Margaret had a way of making neglect sound like guidance. One day, after I helped clean the kitchen and folded laundry while Emily practiced scales in the living room, she said, "You're strong because you have to be." At the time, it sounded like a compliment, but now I hear it differently, like she was excusing herself from ever having to be gentle. Years pass like that. I stopped showing them my report cards, even when they were perfect. I knew they'd ask how Emily was doing in chemistry instead. I still tried, though. I got into AP classes. I volunteered at the library. I read every evening curled up by myself while my sister's latest recital or performance drew everyone to the community center or the country club. On the night of my high school graduation, the sky over Naperville turned peach and lavender as I zipped my gown. I had graduated with honors, ranked 5th in my class. The auditorium buzzed with proud parents and blaring air horns. I scanned the rows until I found my family, sitting stiff in the middle section. Margaret wore pearls and checked her watch twice. Gregory leaned in and whispered something to Emily. She giggled. After the ceremony, when I walked up to them with my diploma folder, all Margaret said was, "Well, that's nice. Now let's talk about Emily's orientation at Northwestern. We need to book a hotel." We took one photo that evening. It was slightly blurry, Gregory holding the camera with one hand while Emily and Margaret stood to my side. I looked at that photo once a week that summer. Not because I loved it, but because I wanted to understand why I wasn't enough to make them proud. But it wasn't just what they did. It was what they said when they thought I wasn't listening. One night in July, I passed by their bedroom door. It was cracked open just enough to hear voices. Gregory said, "Emily's future is full of promise. Lauren's, well, she's reliable. Not exceptional, but steady." And Margaret replied, "We'll always need someone like her, the one who keeps things together." I stood there for a while, not crying, just standing, holding my breath, trying to figure out how that became my place in the family, needed but never celebrated. That night, I took out a notebook from my desk drawer. On the first page, I wrote one sentence. I will become exceptional. Not for them, for me. And from that moment on, I began to plan the life no one expected me to have. Emily's engagement party was a spectacle. Chandeliers strung from trees, a jazz quartet tucked beneath a draped pergola, and lavender champagne passed around on silver trays. I arrived in a black sheath dress that felt a little too practical for the occasion. Guests were already scattered across the lawn, mingling and laughing as if they'd all stepped out of a wedding magazine. I stood at the edge for a moment, clutching a small wrapped gift in my hands, trying to gather the energy to smile. A server passed with a tray of mini crab cakes. I shook my head, more out of habit than appetite. The last time we'd all gathered for something special, I ended up cleaning up after everyone. Emily, in a satin blush gown, floated from table to table like she'd been born for this. Her hair was done in soft waves, her makeup flawless. She spotted me briefly and offered a small wave. Brief, perfunctory, like I was a colleague she once had lunch with. I walked over to the gift table, careful not to step on the flower petals scattered across the stone path. My present, a hand-bound photo album embossed with her name and Ethan's, was laid gently beside a stack of designer boxes. It was custom, thoughtful. I'd spent hours formatting the layout, adding space for Polaroids, writing captions she could fill in herself. When Margaret saw it, she leaned in, gave a tight-lipped smile, and said, "Very thoughtful, Lauren, though I'm sure Emily and Ethan could use something more lasting, like a real contribution." I bit my lip and nodded once. There wasn't any point in explaining the time or care I'd put in. With my family, meaning was always measured in dollar signs. As the evening unfolded, I drifted between the garden tables and hors d'oeuvre stations, mostly alone. The string lights flickered above us as if trying too hard to create warmth. Margaret eventually found me near the edge of the vineyard, where the music was softer and the crowd thinner. "Your father and I wanted a word," she said, looping her arm around mine in a gesture that felt more strategic than affectionate. I followed her through a side path into a smaller patio tucked behind the main tent. Gregory was already there, hands in his pockets, face set with that calm sternness he reserved for job interviews and family interventions. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "That house in Evanston, it's impressive, very grown up." I waited, unsure where this was headed, though a low hum of dread began to build behind my ribs. Margaret stepped in. "It's clear you've worked hard, and we're proud, truly." She smiled with the kind of warmth that usually came before a demand, which is why we think now's the perfect opportunity for you to support Emily. She and Ethan are starting fresh. You're stable. You don't even have a family to support, yet. I blinked. "I'm sorry. Support her how?" Gregory didn't hesitate. "The house. You could transfer the deed." As a wedding gift, I let out a short laugh, thinking they must be joking, but their faces didn't flinch. "That house took me 8 years," I said quietly. "Every bonus, every side job, every weekend I gave up. It's mine." "Exactly," Margaret replied. "It's not like you're struggling, and it would mean so much to Emily. Imagine how grateful she'll be." I looked from one parent to the other. There it was again, my success viewed as a communal asset, not something to be proud of, but something to be allocated. Gregory added, "She's going to be a wife now. She needs stability. You're on your own." There was a silence after that, the kind that stretches not because no one knows what to say, but because everyone has said too much. I turned to the side, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The sky was soft gold, the kind of light photographers pray for. Somewhere back in the tent, the band started playing Ella Fitzgerald. I folded my arms and finally said, "I'm happy for her, but I'm not giving up my home." Margaret's smile tightened. "You're misunderstanding. This isn't about giving up anything, it's about showing love." "Love?" I repeated. Funny how that word always comes with a price tag in this family. Gregory exhaled through his nose. "You're being emotional." "No," I said, calmer than I felt. I'm being clear." There was nothing more to say. I turned back toward the main path, the weight in my chest heavier now. The air smelled of lavender and rosemary, like someone had tried to bottle perfection and spray it across the party. But beneath that scent, I could feel the old bitterness settling in again. As I stepped back into the laughter and music, Emily raised her champagne flute in a toast with Ethan, her diamond ring catching the last of the sun. She looked so radiant, so utterly satisfied. She didn't glance my way. I wondered if she even knew what our parents had just tried to orchestrate. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because it was the only mask I had left to wear. Setting boundaries was foreign in our family. In our house, silence was respect, and obedience was love. The moment you pushed back, you were difficult. The moment you said no, you were the problem. It was late July when my parents visited my home in Lake Forest for the first time. I'd moved in that spring, a small but intentional act of independence I'd saved 8 years to accomplish. The house wasn't flashy. 3 bedrooms, clean lines, warm hardwood floors, a backyard just big enough for a grill and a hammock. To me, it felt like peace. To them, it was unfamiliar territory. Margaret stepped into the foyer, glanced around, and said, "It's very minimal. Don't you ever get tired of all the beige?" I smiled without looking at her. "I like it quiet." Gregory followed behind, inspecting the kitchen with the air of a real estate agent. "You did all this on your own?" "Every inch," I said, wiping a smudge off the counter even though it was spotless. They toured each room slowly, making little remarks. "No family photos?" Margaret asked. I didn't answer. There were framed prints of sunrises, mountains, and a watercolor of a quiet lake. That was the kind of stillness I needed on my walls. In the living room, I poured them glasses of iced tea and sat across from them. The air conditioner hummed lightly, and sunlight streamed through the large windows, falling across the white rug where no one had yet spilled anything. Gregory cleared his throat. "This is nice, Lauren, comfortable, practical." Margaret leaned forward. "And it makes what we need to ask a bit easier." I didn't say anything. I just waited. My heart already knew what was coming. "You remember what we discussed in Napa?" Gregory said. "I do." "We've talked it over again," he continued, "and we really think transferring the house to Emily and Ethan would be best for everyone." "For everyone?" I asked. "Or just for Emily?" Margaret smiled tightly. "It's not a matter of fairness. It's about family, about unity." Gregory nodded. "You've always been responsible. This is your chance to show leadership. Be the one who brings the family together." I felt a sharp pressure behind my ribs, like something inside me was pressing against a wall I'd kept up for decades. "I'm not giving them this house," I said. "It's mine. I earned it, and I don't owe it to anyone." The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Margaret set her glass down with care, but her fingers were tight around the stem. Gregory's voice dropped. "Lauren, we're not asking for a loan. We're asking you to contribute, just like we raised you to." "You raised me to serve Emily," I said, more bluntly than I intended. And I did. I played the helpful sister. I cleaned, I stepped aside, I gave up holidays, attention, affection. But this is where it stops. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's not how we see it." "That's exactly the problem," I replied. Gregory stood. "You're being ungrateful, selfish." "I'm being honest," I said, standing too. He took a step closer. "If you can't support your sister in something as meaningful as this, then maybe you're not the daughter we thought you were." That sentence landed like a slap, but it didn't sting. Not like it used to. I looked at him, at both of them, and saw people who only knew how to love with conditions. "Maybe I'm not," I said quietly. Margaret stood now too, smoothing the hem of her blouse. "Fine, we won't mention it again, but don't expect us to understand why you're choosing to turn your back on your family." "I'm not turning my back on anyone," I said. "I'm just not giving up myself anymore." They left not long after that. No hugs, no lingering, just the sound of the door clicking shut behind them. I stood alone in my living room, the iced tea still sweating on the coasters, untouched. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the rug. I walked over to the window, watched their car disappear down the quiet street, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt grounded. I chose myself, and I wasn't sorry. I arrived at the conservatory just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The glass dome above us glowed gold, casting soft reflections on the marble floors. Cream-colored velvet chairs lined up in perfect symmetry, and every table shimmered with crystal, lace, and the scent of expensive florals I couldn't name. It was the kind of wedding that would live forever on someone's Pinterest board. Emily looked radiant in her gown, her train cascading like water over the steps of the altar. Guests milled about with flutes of champagne, already snapping photos beneath the floral arch. I stood near the entrance, watching it all from a quiet corner. I hadn't been assigned a seat with the family. No one had even texted me after the engagement party. But I came anyway, partly out of politeness, mostly to prove, to myself maybe, that I still had the strength to show up. As I stepped further into the conservatory, Margaret spotted me. She was wearing a navy silk wrap dress, flawless as ever, her smile stretched tight across her face. "Lauren," she said, her tone as polished as the floor beneath us, "your father would like a word. He's waiting near the cake." I hesitated. "I won't keep you long," she added, gesturing toward a curtained-off alcove near the far end of the hall. I followed. Gregory stood beside the towering cake, a 5-tier sculpture of sugar flowers and ivory fondant. He didn't look at me right away. He just stared ahead, hands folded in front of him. Then slowly he turned. "This is your last chance," he said. "We don't need to ruin today." "I'm not here to ruin anything," I replied. He stepped closer. "Then prove it. Give Emily the house. Be a good sister. Make things right." I shook my head. "My answer hasn't changed." He blinked, his jaw tightening. "You're choosing division." "I'm choosing myself." Margaret entered behind him, closing the space like a door slamming shut. "We raised you better than this, Lauren. Family means sacrifice." "I've sacrificed enough," I said. "You just didn't notice because it was convenient for you not to." Margaret's lips thinned. "You think you're above us now? With your little job and your little house? You think that makes you right? I think I worked for what I have, and I won't apologize for it." Gregory stepped forward. "You're embarrassing us. At your sister's wedding. Look at you, cold, defiant, selfish." "I'm not selfish," I said quietly. "I'm done being controlled." There was a stillness in the air, the kind that falls before something terrible happens. Gregory's face darkened. "You don't get to shame this family." He reached for something on the table. I didn't see it clearly at first, just a sudden blur of movement, the shine of metal, the weight of anger in his arm. Then the pain hit. A crack against my temple, loud and hot and blinding. I fell sideways. The cake base had connected cleanly. The world tilted. Gasps echoed. Someone screamed. I hit the floor, my cheek pressed to velvet, now warm and wet. I heard Margaret yell, "She's doing this on purpose. She's trying to ruin everything." And then Daniel's voice, sharp, urgent, cutting through the chaos. "She's bleeding. She needs help. Someone call 911. My vision swam, white lights fracturing overhead. I felt hands near me, someone lifting my shoulder, someone yelling, "Don't move her," over and over. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. But I saw Emily, standing a few feet away, her hands frozen mid-clap, her lips parted slightly. No one moved to help me. No one from my family, anyway. I heard more footsteps, glasses clinking to the ground, guests backing away. Then, the sirens. The curtain flew open. 2 officers appeared, one male, one female. Their eyes moved from the crowd to my bloodied dress to Gregory, still standing there like a statue. "Sir," the male officer said, "drop the object and step away from her." Gregory slowly lowered the metal base, now streaked with red. The female officer turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, we need you to remain silent for now." "She did this!" Margaret shrieked. "She provoked him!" "Ma'am," the officer said again, more firmly this time, "turn around, you're both under arrest." Handcuffs clicked. Guests murmured. Phones filmed. I caught one last glimpse of Emily. Her mascara hadn't moved, but her expression had. She looked cracked. They walked my parents out of the conservatory past over 160 stunned faces. No one clapped. No one cheered. Just the low hum of disbelief filling the silence. I was still on the floor when a medic arrived. Daniel stayed beside me, gripping my hand. "Help's here. Just stay with me, okay?" But my mind was somewhere else. Somewhere far away from the cake, the blood, the gasps. Somewhere quiet. Because in that moment, pain and all, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt free. They taught me silence was survival. But that fall, inside a courtroom lined with oak and marble, silence was no longer an option. The Lake County District Courthouse was colder than I expected. Polished floors, brass fixtures, and a faint smell of floor wax. Reporters waited outside like moths circling a porch light. I walked past them without a word, my hand tucked firmly inside Marcus Whitmore's arm. He was calm, focused, exactly what I needed. Inside, the gallery filled quickly. Some faces I recognized from the wedding, some I didn't. A few wore expressions I couldn't read. Sympathy, curiosity, judgment. I didn't care. This wasn't about any of them. I sat down at the plaintiff's table. Gregory and Margaret were already seated across the aisle, dressed in coordinated navy suits, looking more like executives than defendants. Margaret's expression was blank, but Gregory's jaw was tight, the same jaw that clenched when I said no for the first time in my life. The trial began with opening statements. Marcus stood with ease, addressing the jury. 9 people, mostly middle-aged, their eyes steady, their hands folded. He laid out the charges like laying bricks: aggravated assault, prolonged emotional abuse, and attempted unlawful coercion of property. "This is not just about one violent moment," he said. "It's about a pattern, a lifetime of minimizing, of demanding, of silencing. And when silence no longer worked, they struck." The defense attorney, a man named Reeves with a silver tie and a voice made for spin, rose next. He painted me as an emotional woman holding on to childhood resentments. "No family is perfect," he said. "Sometimes emotions run high, but intent matters, and so does forgiveness." When I took the stand, I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I spoke. I told them about the spelling bee cake and the forgotten essays, about cleaning while Emily practiced piano, about watching my parents photograph her recitals while I sat backstage alone. I told them about building my life from scratch, quietly, steadily, only to be told it was meant for someone else. Then I told them about the cake base. "I didn't fall," I said. "He swung." And for once, everyone saw it. Marcus brought up the video footage. 6 angles from 6 guests. The sound of the impact, the blood, Margaret's voice shouting accusations, the medics, the guests backing away. "No one looked away during that part," Daniel testified. So did Ethan. Even 2 distant relatives who had barely spoken to me at the wedding stood up and told the truth. I don't think they ever liked me, but they liked justice more. The defense tried to argue heat of the moment, that Gregory had snapped, panicked, regretted it immediately, but the video didn't show regret. It showed entitlement, control lost, and panic only after the sirens came. Margaret claimed I had fabricated the house dispute. But then Marcus brought out a series of text messages, ones Emily had sent to a mutual friend, boasting that, once Lauren hands over the keys, we can finally start fresh in the suburbs. I watched the jury as the texts were read. Not a single expression changed. They had already made up their minds. 3 days passed like slow thunder. I sat through each moment grounded by Marcus, by Ethan, by the weight of my own resolve. On the final day, we stood as the jury filed back in. The room held its breath. The foreperson, a woman with streaks of gray in her braid, stood and cleared her throat. We find the defendants, Gregory and Margaret Chen, guilty on all counts. There was no gasp, just a quiet release of air from somewhere behind me. The judge, a woman named Morrison, firm and composed, delivered the sentence without ceremony. Based on the gravity of the evidence and the sustained pattern of abuse, I sentenced both defendants to 8 years in state custody. No parole for the first 6. In addition, the court orders $320,000 in damages, medical, legal, and emotional. Margaret didn't move. Gregory clenched his fists. Neither looked at me. They were handcuffed in silence. Outside the courtroom, the sky was overcast. A light drizzle painted the courthouse steps. Reporters asked questions. Cameras clicked. Marcus deflected with professionalism. Ethan held an umbrella over me as we made our way down the stairs. "You didn't just win," he said, voice low beside me. "You changed everything." I didn't answer right away. The courthouse loomed behind us, but I wasn't looking back. Somewhere, news stations were already running the story. Wedding assault case. Daughter wins in court. There were online threads full of strangers debating loyalty, control, trauma. But none of that mattered as much as the simple, quiet thing I felt in my chest. Not pride, not victory, relief, not because they were punished, but because, for once, I was heard. For years, I wanted closure. I thought it would feel like a locked door, a final word, a deep breath with nothing left behind. But that spring morning, standing in the backyard of the home I once defended alone, I understood something softer. Closure isn't the end. It's the place where beginning becomes possible. The sky above Evanston was pale blue, streaked with the kind of morning light that makes everything look gentle. White folding chairs dotted the trimmed lawn. Daisies lined the edge of the stone path, blooming without permission or fanfare, just as I had learned to. Ethan stood beside me in a crisp shirt, no tie. His hand was warm in mine. Marcus officiated, smiling like a man who had seen both the worst and the best and still believed in something in between. Our wedding was quiet. No cake towers, no stage, no forced speeches, just 30 people. People who had shown up not for tradition but for truth. After we said our vows, written on index cards, not printed programs, we served lemonade in mason jars and passed around homemade cupcakes. The music came from an old Bluetooth speaker perched on the porch rail, playing an acoustic version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And no one filmed, no one posted. Everyone was present. Later that afternoon, I stood up and gave a small speech. Not rehearsed, just felt. I used to think family meant who raised you, I said. Now I know it's who sees you and stays. To those of you who stood beside me when I felt invisible, thank you. You reminded me I was worth being seen. There were quiet tears. Ethan kissed my cheek. Marcus raised a glass. By early evening, string lights blinked to life between the trees. Someone started a small fire in the pit, and we passed blankets around our knees. Laughter mixed with cicada song. I remember thinking, I have never known peace like this. A few weeks later, we opened the doors to Restore, the nonprofit Ethan and I helped launch with Marcus and a few others. It was tucked between a used bookstore and a bakery, its glass windows lined with watercolor posters and flyers about emotional safety, legal resources, and survivor groups. Our first visitor was a woman in her 50s, wearing a blue windbreaker and holding her purse like a shield. She didn't say much at first, just sat with me in the intake room, sipping tea. Then, just before she left, she took my hand and whispered, "I didn't know I was allowed to leave. Until I heard your story." I hugged her, not with pity, but with recognition. Some days I still think about my old life, about how I used to flinch when someone said my name, but now it no longer feels like a bruise. It feels like mine, whole, worn, survived. In the corner of our living room, there's a shelf we call the Justice Corner. On it sits a photo of our wedding day, Ethan laughing, daisies blooming, and beside it the court verdict sealed in a walnut frame. Not to gloat, just to remember. They once called me selfish for keeping my house. Now I use it to house hope. When I look at the daisies blooming in my backyard or the verdict framed on our shelf, I don't see pain anymore. I see proof. Proof that even after years of being overlooked, you can still choose yourself and begin again. Sometimes the people who were supposed to love us the most fall short, but that doesn't mean we stop believing in kindness, fairness, or hope. Because in this life, healing doesn't always come from fixing what broke. It comes from building something new that lasts. If this story touched something in you, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts. You're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, this is your beginning too.